Did you know that LucasArts, or more recently LucasFilms Games, actually made a Mech game? Not just that, but one that clearly took inspiration from some of the most groundbreaking and sadly widely forgotten mech games that came before it. Well, you do now. What's even more interesting is that this game is often mistaken as a sequel to some of its inspirations. I can't tell you how many times I've been told to check it out because someone believes that it somehow ties to either Cybernator or Metal Storm on the Nintendo. The truth though is that it's not connected to either of those titles. Not even a little bit. Sure, it does feature an aiming system similar to Cybernator's, and it does include a power-up system that allows for the same flipping, gravity-defying movement seen in Metal Storm, though, to be fair, it's practically useless here. But the biggest key difference is that both of those games were very much Japanese productions. This mech title, on the other hand, was developed by LucasArts, and only published by a Japanese company, Konami. And I'm not going to just gloss over the name LucasArts like they didn't have an absolute stranglehold on the industry at the time. We all know that the vast majority of LucasArts output was tied to George Lucas related properties. You know, Star Wars this and Indiana Jones that. This video would be 20 minutes long solely by mentioning the breadth of those titles alone. But anyhow, for those of you watching who probably know more about all this than I do, LucasArts' non-Star Wars and Indiana Jones games were often extremely ambitious, sometimes groundbreaking, and nearly always gems. We all know Full Throttle, and Maniac Mansion's excellent sequel, Day of the Tentacle, which I personally consider among the best point-and-click adventure games I've ever played. But did you also know that they were responsible for the Monkey Island series? Well, of course you did. Everyone does. It goes without saying that LucasArts wasn't a one-trick pony. They released games in just about any genre they felt like, and their titles were placed on nearly anything that would play them. Maniac Mansion alone had 6 different ports: Amiga, Apple II, Atari ST, Commodore 64, MS-DOS, and the Nintendo Entertainment System. This was a trend for a while, though some titles like Defender of Dynatron City and The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles on the Nintendo remained exclusives. It was a master plan, saturate the market, and LucasArts would become a household name in a matter of years. And it certainly worked. Much like George Lucas himself, the game studio namesake still has its hooks in the industry. Of course, like any other studio that sticks around for more than a few years, LucasArts experienced its fair share of growing pains as the gaming industry evolved. The usual corporate drama, shifts in focus, and ultimately, oversaturation took their toll. By 2003, people were straight up fatigued by an influx of Star Wars titles. That year alone saw the release of Knights of the Old Republic, Jedi Academy, Starfighter, Rogue Squadron 3, and several others, collectively raking in about $100 million in revenue. Sounds like a lot, right? Well, maybe for you and me, but considering the budget and expectations for those games, it wasn't quite the financial win LucasArts needed. Hilariously, Halo, just the first game, had well surpassed that amount on its own. Though, I'm going to say that was likely due to the multiplayer component becoming rampantly popular. That, and how Bungie knew how to make the game's weaknesses feel like intentional gameplay elements. Now, don't get me wrong, I think most of those Star Wars titles that year were great. I absolutely loved Knights of the Old Republic, and I heard solid things about the others. But at that point, LucasArts was becoming a sinking ship, and aside from a few notable releases, they never truly recovered. In fact, I know this might be a bit of a no-no to say, but most of what's come out under the LucasFilms Games brand after Disney's buyout, the studio's shuttering of employees, and its eventual rebranding has been plagued by controversy and disappointment, though mostly disappointment. So yeah, LucasArts made a mech game, and in many ways, it represents an era when they were willing to experiment, take risks, and push boundaries, something we didn't really see from their legacy near the end. Though, to be fair, those boundaries had often already been pushed by titles before them. Metal Warriors is basically an amalgamation of just about everything mech that North American audiences had been exposed to outside of BattleTech and its various game series. It all starts with the cover, where the featured mech looks almost copyright infringingly close to Char's Sazabi from Gundam's first theatrical outing, Char's Counterattack. I didn't even have to squint. This thing is undoubtedly a secondhand Sazabi, and I have a sneaking suspicion they knew it too, since some of the game's advertisements featured a completely different 3D rendered mech that looks nothing like the one on the cover. In-game, this mech is called Nitro, or it possibly could be the Havoc, and it's been redesigned probably to create some distance from the obvious ripoff, just, not on the cover apparently. Mike Ebert and Dean Sharp, best known for Zombies Ain't My Neighbors, were the lead developers behind Metal Warriors. Ebert wasn't shy about his inspirations, frequently citing Gundam, Armored Trooper Voltums, Blaster Master, and Cybernator as key influences, which probably explains why the box art's Mech looks like a Sazabi, and the Prometheus looks an awful lot like a Marauder from Battletech, or, the Officer's Battle Pod from Macross, or Robotech. So, a clone of a recut, allegedly, of course. Sadly, I wouldn't say the story is much more than Gundam fanfiction. You play as a soldier from the United Earth government, basically the Earth Federation forces, fighting against Dark Axis. Axis Zeon, the first Neo-Zeon movement. I mean, could it be any clearer that this game's biggest inspiration was Char's counterattack? One nice touch though is that the game lets you rename your character from the options menu. It's not exactly groundbreaking even for the time, but it's a cool feature. I'm sure someone out there will probably be renaming their character to either Amuro or Char now. Weirdly though, it's somewhat hidden. It would have made more sense to prompt the player for their name at the start of the game. Harrison Fong, who had prior experience in the mecha genre through Dark Horse's Mecha comic series, was responsible for the game's cutscenes and mech designs. I do wonder if he had a hand in that Sazabi lookalike on the cover. It wouldn't be too surprising. His art style definitely has some Macross influence. Ebert's many inspirations were clearly realized in this game. As I mentioned before, Metal Warriors incorporates elements from Cybernator and Metal Storm, though not as directly as some might claim. The closest inspiration for Metal Warriors, I'd argue, is Metal Mech on the NES. That game allowed the pilot to leave their mech at any time to solve puzzles and explore, a mechanic Metal Warriors fully embraces. In fact, the entire game feels more like a love letter to Metal Mech than anything else, with many levels designed around this feature. Personally, I'm glad another game actually did something with this concept. The only other 2D game I've played with a similar mechanic is Panzer Paladin. The game takes steps to integrate this functionality into mission objectives, like one instance where the player has to exit their mech to commandeer a dropship. Other mechs beyond the default Nitro model are scattered throughout stages, and you can pilot anything that hasn't already been taken by an enemy. The Nitro itself is the game's most versatile mech, capable of flying longer distances and generally being the best tool for getting out of tricky situations. The Havoc is a heavy hitter with fast movement, but it can only jump boost, which I found incredibly frustrating. The Prometheus is slow and completely incapable of jumping, but it compensates with a powerful close-range flamethrower and a multifunctional cannon that can either fire by dispersing a round or a standard shot depending on how long you hold the fire button. The Spider is an agile unit that can climb walls, absorb projectiles with an energy web, and turn invisible, but the controls reverse when scaling walls, which is incredibly annoying. The Ballistic is a siege-style mech and probably the most complex in the game. It rolls around, can perform a Sonic-style spin dash for movement, and has to remain still to aim and fire. I rarely used it, partially because I often mistook its unmanned state for an enemy. Lastly, there's the Drosh, or the Droshe, or something, which isn't a mech at all, but a flyer. It's the fastest unit in the game. Its quirk is that the face buttons all become fire buttons, each representing a different shooting direction. It has a special slam move that can be useful, but let's be real, you're not going to be thinking about slamming a flyer down on enemies most of the time. Power-ups are available, but most of them are completely useless. Missiles are the only ones worth picking up since they are often required to destroy certain parts of the environment to uncover secrets. There's a bouncing, explosive ball launcher, but it's utterly ineffective because the balls ricochet off everything, including what you're aiming at. The gravity switching item, a pointless gimmick as I've said before. The speed pickup, it's cool, but so rare that it might as well not exist at all. You can also get temporary upgrades to your fire mode, like bouncing or homing projectiles, but they're far too uncommon. And since they're limited use, the game never really gives you enough time to experiment with them before they're gone. That's okay though, because none of this really takes away from just how well balanced Metal Warriors is. Gameplay wise, this has to be one of the tightest experiences I've ever had on the Super Nintendo, or Super Famicom if you're one of those people. Its moment-to-moment combat takes cues from Cybernator, or Assault Suit Valken if you're me. But whereas that game was hyper-structured and required a solid level of skill, yes, I'm aware that level of skill was something I didn't have when I covered the series back in the day, Metal Warriors is far more accessible for several reasons. First off, it's downright easier. Enemies aren't particularly tough to take down since their main behavior is homing in on you and shooting. That's not to say they're brain dead though. They will back off and guard themselves when necessary. Even the human enemies, which seem harmless compared to mechs, can be a real pain at times. They're capable of hijacking an enemy mech if you leave it unattended or providing resistance when you're on foot. My only real gripe is the sheer number of cannon turrets in the first half of the game. They aren't unfairly placed, but running into them constantly got old fast. They pack a serious punch, and sometimes they're firing at you from off screen. Speaking of screen though, that brings me to one of the game's cooler design choices. There's no HUD. Instead, you get visual cues on how damaged your mech is. There's also no ammo count. Aside from power-ups, you have infinite ammo. For a 1995 Super Nintendo game, that's surprisingly ahead of its time, and it keeps the screen uncluttered. Much like the Assault Suit series, this game features highly structured missions with linear objectives that are tied well into the story. Thanks to the included cutscenes, you always know what your mission is and why you're doing it. Sometimes it's a series of destroying a core or taking down a massive set of worm-like mechs. Other times, you'll be protecting a ship in space, defending power modules, or taking over an enemy dropship to escape. There are a few bosses, but honestly, there should have been more. The game only has 3, and I feel like it needed at least 2 more. If you manage to get through the entire game without dying until right before the final mission, you unlock a secret area called the Tower, where you face a repeat of a previous boss. But that's just a repeat, not something cool like the giant mechanized worms from the Fire mission. If I had it my way, we'd have way more of that. Unfortunately, Metal Warriors falls into the same trap as many games of its kind did. It's an incredibly fun, short burst experience that just doesn't last very long. I didn't use emulator save states or anything like that. I played through it 3 times, and honestly, that felt like enough. Many missions have straightforward objectives, and the main secrets just involve finding extra mechs or power-ups. I did enjoy experimenting with missiles to uncover hidden areas or seeing which walls could be destroyed, but ultimately, after 3 playthroughs, even while dying in some, the game clocks in about roughly 3 hours, even when factoring in exploration and bonus levels. If you manage to beat the game without dying, you unlock a basketball minigame. I love weird bonus levels like that, kind of like what they did in Ranger X. Oh, and there is a head-to-head split-screen deathmatch mode. I'm sure plenty of people got a kick out of it back in the day since it offers multiple maps to mess around with. It's dead simple, but hey, this was a 1995 Super Nintendo game. Having a mode like this as a bonus feature was a pretty big deal for console gamers at the time. It's no NetMech on the PC, but if you got a second player around, it's a bit of extra fun. Oh, and if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to leave a like and drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts on Metal Warriors or if you've ever played it before. And if you want more reviews like this, consider subscribing. Likes and comments help boost engagement and push this video to others who might be interested. So if you're already subbed and not sure what to comment, just type prosper to let everybody know you made it this far.
We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.
Now let's talk about the soundtrack, composed by David Warhol and Eric Swanson. And wow, this is where you're really gonna hear the connection to Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Don't get me wrong, the music is great. It follows the adventurous tone of Cybernator or Assault Suit Valken, and I've seen mention that it was somehow inspired by Blaster Master as well, but I don't hear that at all. The best way to describe Metal Warriors soundtrack? Cybernator with the instrument set of Zombies Ate My Neighbors. It brings a certain upbeat energy that reminds me of some shoot-'em-ups, reinforcing the game's constant action. But I mean, this is from the Zombies Ate My Neighbors guys, so you know it's filled with catchy, repetitive earworms that you'll love until they drive you nuts after a few hours. It was really fun to go back and check out one of these older 2D console titles while chewing through some larger projects. There's so much ambition packed into these games, and it's not just surprising to learn that LucasArts was behind it, but also that the team responsible for Zombies Ate My Neighbors was involved somewhat. Not only because they were skilled developers, but because one of the project leads was a huge fan of mech related stuff. It's a wild world, and with games like this out there is absolutely no reason to be bored. Thank you for watching. For those of you who have reached the end of the video, you're amazing and I can't thank you enough. I'm Kei-Nova and I'll see you in the next video.